Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. The Washington Post motto is, "Democracy dies in darkness." There's two ways of interpreting that. One is that it's a warning, and the other is that it's their plan. Here's the headlines on Google News today. Washington Post: Greenland is on track to lose most ice on record this year and has already shed 250 billion tons. And then, Live Science: Greenland lost 217 billion tons of ice last month. And CBS News: Greenland melt. Greenland's ice sheet just lost 11 billion tons of ice in one day. Wow, that sounds bad. We really messed up the climate this time. It says it right there in the Washington Post. Here's the surface mass balance graph for Greenland from the Danish Meteorological Institute. This graph shows that snow starts accumulating on Greenland about the beginning of September and keeps falling there until the end of May. On average, about 600 billion tons of snow accumulates on Greenland's surface between the beginning of September and the end of May. If there wasn't any loss of ice from Greenland during the summer, that snow would just keep piling up higher and higher every year till it got up to the top of the troposphere. Obviously that can't happen, so there's two mechanisms by which Greenland loses mass during the summertime. One is by melting from the surface, which you can see in this curve here. For about 2.5 months a year, temperatures on parts of the ice sheet are above freezing, and quite a bit of melting occurs, typically around 200 billion tons during the summer melts. This gray area shows the typical range of the surface mass balance. Some years there's a lot of new snow left over at the end of the summer, and other years there's a lot less. Melting from the surface is not the only way that Greenland loses ice. As snow accumulates in the interior of Greenland, it turns to ice, and then it flows downhill towards the sea and calves off into the ocean. Glaciers are rivers of ice. They're very similar to rivers of water, except that they're much more viscous and they flow much more slowly. Think about how slowly a river of molasses would flow. And ice is much more viscous than even molasses, so it'll flow very slowly. The fastest glaciers in Greenland move towards the sea somewhere in the range of 10 feet per day. So between the two mechanisms of surface melt and glaciers flowing into the sea, Greenland typically loses about as much mass every year as it gains. But as far as the surface mass balance goes, a lot less snow melts every year than falls during the winter. A notable exception to this was the year 2012, shown with the red line. You can see that almost all of the snow that fell during the winter melted during the summer. There was only about 50 billion tons of new snow remaining at the end of the summer in 2012. And the blue line shows the surface mass balance for this year. You can see that less snow than average fell during the winter, and it's been melting relatively quickly. So maybe the Washington Post is telling the truth when they say, Greenland is on track to lose most ice on record this year and has already shed 250 billion tons. Well, let's take a look at that. I annotated the Danish Meteorological Institute graph. The red rectangle shows the melt which occurred during the year 2012, and the blue rectangle shows the melt which has occurred this year. As you can see, a lot more melt occurred during the year 2012 than this year, almost twice as much. Short of an asteroid strike, it's extremely unlikely that this year could catch up with 2012. In fact, since they started out a lower number, it's probably mathematically impossible for this year to exceed 2012. Temperatures have already turned cold in Greenland, and this is going to flatline pretty soon. Probably somewhere around here is where the final surface mass balance will end up. This year will end up low, but it'll still be within the normal gray range. So the Washington Post, "Democracy dies in darkness," is spreading misinformation. Their headline here is simply not true, like so many of their other headlines. Now let's look at the other out-of-context hysteria being promoted by Live Science and CBS News. Greenland lost 217 billion tons of ice last month. Greenland melt. Greenland's ice sheet just lost 11 billion tons of ice in one day. Wow, 11 billion tons in one day. That sounds like a lot. People on the beach better pack up and run away. These people on the beach this afternoon in Miami must be really terrified. Look at that panic. Obviously, I'm being facetious. 11 billion tons of ice melt in Greenland will produce a completely imperceptible sea level rise. a tiny fraction of a millimeter. Now let's look at the graph of daily surface mass balance from the Danish Meteorological Institute. These blue spikes from September till May correspond to large snowstorms in Greenland. On 2 days last November, one day they got 10 billion tons of new snow, and the next day they got 12 billion tons of new snow. But of course, people at the Washington Post and other news agencies don't report on these huge snowstorms which fall on Greenland during the winter. Instead of reporting on the dozen large snowstorms during the winter, they report on the one large melting event in the summer, which was actually smaller than the largest snowstorm. So for the press, this one event in the summer is climate, and all of these large snowstorms in the winter were just weather. And on average, much more snow falls during the winter than melts during the summer. This year, the total mass gain will be smaller than average, but when August ends, there will still be about 200 billion tons more snow on the surface than there was a year earlier. And if it wasn't for glaciers flowing down to the sea and calving, this would keep piling up, like I said earlier, till it got to the top of the troposphere. Obviously, that can't happen. In order to remain in equilibrium, Greenland has to lose as much ice every year as falls during the winter. 600 billion tons of ice has to discharge into the sea or melt every summer. Climate alarmists get hysterical when they see glaciers calving into the ocean or the surface melting, but it's an essential part of the cycle in Greenland, and it happens every year. In the year 1912, the Titanic crashed into a very large iceberg which had calved off of one of these Arctic glaciers. The scientific illiteracy of climate alarmists is actually quite stunning. They don't understand the very basic principles of science. But this story gets much worse. This graph shows the surface mass balance for Greenland for the last 3 years. 2017 had near record snowfall and very little melting during the summer. And a similar story for 2018. They both gained huge amounts of ice well above normal during those summers. But climate alarmists aren't interested in that. All they care about is years like this year when there's below normal accumulation. If you total up the last 3 years in Greenland, the surface mass balance is far above the average from 1981 to 2010. Greenland is currently in a phase where it's gaining ice, not losing it. If the Washington Post was interested in telling the truth, they would have discussed this instead of their fake hysteria about this summer. Now let's look at another claim in their article. Arctic sea ice is also at a record low as a warmer than average summer takes its toll. Here's today's graph from the Danish Meteorological Institute of Arctic sea ice extent. This red dot right here shows the current extent. It's nowhere near a record low. The record low is actually way down here, and it's just about average for the date in recent years. Here's a graph of the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index, MASI, every day since their start of records at the beginning of 2006. Every winter the Arctic gains ice and every summer it loses it. It forms a nice cyclical waveform. One year that was very interesting was 2012, which had the highest maximum and also the smallest minimum during the summer. This point here is the current date, and you can see that it's nowhere near the 2012 minimum. In this next graph, I've plotted out the maximum extent, the average extent, and the minimum extent for every year in the MASI record. As you can see, there's no trend in any of them. Maximums are not getting larger or smaller, average is not getting larger or smaller, and the minimum is doing the same thing. It's just a flat line going from left to right across the graph. This little spike at the end in 2019 for the average and minimum don't mean anything because the summer's not over yet, and both of these will get lower as the summer progresses. But here's the alarmist really big problem for the rest of the summer. This is today's map of Arctic sea ice extent from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. Almost all of the ice in the East Siberian and the Chukchi Seas has already melted out. This ice near the North Pole is not going to melt. Temperatures are already dropping below freezing there. So the only hope for climate alarmists at this point is for this ice in the Beaufort Sea to melt. Here's the weather forecast for the next 2 weeks from the National Center for Environmental Prediction. As you can see, the Beaufort Sea is very cold. Temperatures are already below freezing there, and they're just going to get colder. And the freezing temperatures are going to spread into northern Alaska next week. It's been extremely cloudy in this region of the Arctic the last few weeks. There's no sun hitting the water. Unless a big winter storm comes and breaks up this ice, it's not going to melt. It's possible that could happen. That's what happened in 2012 when they had the record low. But an early winter storm would have nothing to do with global warming. Climate alarmists are going to have to get out their blowtorches if they want to get a big melt this year. The prospects are not looking good for them right now with the cold weather over the Beaufort Sea. Now let's compare the current extent of Arctic sea ice with what it looked like in 1971. This map was published in 1971 by National Geographic and shows the extent of the ice at the end of the summer that year. Look how far the ice was off the coast of Alaska and Siberia, hundreds of miles offshore, just like this year. Unless a big winter storm comes and breaks up this ice, this year is going to end up looking very similar to 1971 during the Ice Age scare. So basically everything in the Washington Post article was either misinformation or intentional disinformation. Their claim about record melt in Greenland simply isn't true. It's not even close to being true. They completely failed to mention that over the last 3 years, the surface mass balance in Greenland is far above normal. And their claim that sea ice is at a record low is just fundamental disinformation. The Washington Post is intentionally creating huge amounts of darkness. Maybe that's why they make their background black. If they believe that democracy dies in darkness, apparently that's their plan. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science, propaganda, and organized crime for a long time.